Hey, Roman.
Hi guys.
Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Great. So far.
Hey,
Hi Lee.
how's it going?
All good. Okay. Lots on the agenda.
Yeah, we've had a busy summer so far, haven't we?
Yeah, and lots of people attending. And then let's see. Okay.
Hello, hello.
Hey, you.
Hi. How is everyone?
Good.
Excellent.
Good.
It's Thursday. Almost at the weekend. Has everybody been getting some time off over the summer?
I'm off next week.
Oh, nice.
I'm actually off this week. This is
Oh,
my
wait.
yeah, my stint coming back in.
Oh,
But we just got back yesterday from drive up to Yosemite.
oh,
was great.
nice.
Yeah.
Wow. Was it super busy or was it not too bad?
Not too bad. You have to get a reservation to drive into the park.
Yeah.
Which is nice. So there's actually very little traffic.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Wow.
But don't they have like fires this year or? around the
Yeah,
this
it
time?
was going to be a bit of a game time call. I had my eye on the Purple Air app that shows you all the like air quality index across the map. And it was actually not that bad. It was like just smoky
Hey.
enough that you got kind of the crazy sunset colors, but like not
Oh,
smoky
wow.
enough that it was bothersome.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, that sounds like fun though. So you're ending your vacation by having a working group meeting. It sounds like fun too.
Still is.
Yeah. Benji, what are you doing? Any big plans?
Just going away with family. Like we've not met much family over the last few years,
Yeah.
obviously, and
Yeah.
gonna go hang out in a field somewhere.
Awesome.
Sounds like a blast.
Yeah.
Are you feeling more comfortable to get into crowds again, Benji?
No, not at all.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, edging my way back in. Maybe next year, but yeah, at the moment I'm just changing medications at the moment, so don't really know what my immune system's doing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Play it safe. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Tim, by the way.
Hello.
Michael. Hello.
Hi,
Tuning
everybody.
in from Portland.
Yes.
Roman,
Hey.
What are you doing in Portland?
RustConf is tomorrow.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
I do the Michael style of traveling one day and then I fly back. What you did with with GraphQL Conf in Austin.
Yeah, it was quite
A whirlwind,
that's a-
whirlwind tour.
that's a long flight for just one day.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you have to squeeze these things in, and then
Yeah, but when you're on the plane longer than you're actually there, I don't know if that's that's always fun.
The plane
Yeah,
has
my-
Wi-Fi these days.
Yeah. That's true.
yeah, that's true. And the new MacBooks really last the whole flight. So
I'm merging pull requests as I see them, by the way.
yeah, there were a lot of pull requests with CLR failed. So
Mhm.
Ooh, okay.
much.
Is that because of CLA bot issues or?
No, I
think
thought like
Just not signed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 All right, we'll get started in a minute or so. Just giving folks time to show up.
Sounds great.
I might alpha sort the attendees just to make it easier to scan through them. Okay, I'm going to do that now because I don't see any pull requests coming. new meeting schedule. Oh yeah, spoilers. Right. I tried to do my due diligence here and like actually write something down before we talk about it rather than doing it live. Spoilers are good. All right. I just merged some pull requests and updated our attendee list. So if you wouldn't mind doing a quick reload of the agenda file if you got it open. And then we'll get things rolling. Awesome. All right, everybody, welcome to the August 2022 edition of the GraphQL Working Group meeting. Of course, as we all join, that means that we are in agreement with the spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct. There's links in the agenda, all of those as per usual. So go take a read if you've forgotten what's in them. Pretty decently written, if I do say so myself. Okay, as we like to do, let's start off with a quick round of intros, just a quick name to face. We will go in the order that it appears in the agenda file, which is exactly first name alpha sort this time, with the exception of me, because I'm the one who talks first and it makes it easier for me to intro first. So hello, everyone. My name is Lee, here representing the GraphQL Foundation.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm at Pronto AI.
Hey everyone, Benji from GraphQL.
I don't see Darius.
Hasn't joined yet. Doesn't look like it.
Perhaps in a bit. That means you're up next, Doc.
Hi, I think I need to add my name to the attendee list. That's what I was looking at the GitHub thing. Anyway, my name is Doc Jones. I'm the GraphQL lead at Postman.
Hi, all. Hugh from Apollo.
Hi, Ivan, also from Apollo.
I'm Mary, also from Apollo.
I'm Matt here from Meta.
I am Michael from Chili Cream.
Morris from IBM.
Hi, I'm Roman from Microsoft.
I don't see Solomon here yet. Or Stefano for that matter.
Hi, I'm Steven of Netflix.
I'm Tim from Stellate.
And Barachit, I don't see on the call yet. Is Yakov here?
Yeah.
No, not yet. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for doing a quick name to face. Did we miss anybody? I think we got everyone.
You missed me because I failed to add myself on time to the invite. I'll do that soon. I'm Gabriel McAdams. I'm currently at Workday, but not representing them, representing myself, and I am working on the GraphQL over HTTP spec.
Welcome, Gabe. Sorry for missing you there. Thanks for adding your name to the list. Awesome. And I see, as per usual, Benji busily filling in our notes. But I know that Benji also has some items up for discussion. So would anyone be willing to volunteer to help take notes?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Let's take a quick look over at our agenda. As is becoming typical, we have a packed agenda, which is awesome. I'll do a quick read through of our action items from past meetings. Although I don't know that we have too much action since the last one. After the last meeting, we had a quick discussion about overflow or changing to cadence, I opened a discussion about that. I'd like to talk about a proposal I have there. A update about GraphQL over HTTP, a parsing stress test project. Sounds exciting. Bench is going to go deep on a struct type, which somehow has a self-referential acronym. Love it. Allowing unions to include abstract types from Yakov. GraphQL's definition and clarifying the role of the SDL, and specifying extension properties on requests. Finally, a discussion on chapter ordering in the spec. I suspect that we might not get through all of this, but we will do our best to stay on time and try to get through all of it. Anything else that we would like to discuss that's not on this list? Or does anyone want to propose any reordering of what's here?
Can I make a short note? I tried to get there early with my agenda, but people come in later inserting their stuff before, and I'm afraid that in the, not the first time, but maybe fifth time, I will be at the very end and we will have overflow time.
So we've never really. Yeah, let me pull one of them. Is there one in particular you want to make sure we get to today? I know you have a couple in here.
Just formal GraphQL definition, mine. It ended up in the very end, I believe, when I was inserting it there. So just a general note or ask.
Yep.
For everybody.
I will lift that up to be after the struct, because I know that one also got bumped from the last meeting. We have a, I don't know if we've ever formalized this, but we ought to. Part of the idea with mentioning the requested time slot was that we would time sort the agenda so that shorter topics get discussed sooner and the later topics fall to the end of the meeting. I'm not going to reorder the one we have now, but we might want to do better at being time cops and then sorting in the future. Yeah. Hopefully it makes it a little bit more fair as to the order they show up. But we might be able to get to everything today. Let's see how far we get through this.
I'll also comment that one of the other things is if you have a conflict, for example, two people raise items at the same time or similar times before they get merged, whichever one gets merged first ends up at the bottom, bizarrely, when you click the resolve all by just accepting both changes. And I tend to just do that stuff quickly, just click the button, click merge. So apologies if that does change the order of things. It's just faster.
Okay, no problem. Are we making break?
Good call, Roman. Yes. We will do a break. Yeah, let's do it like 5 minutes before the hour. That way we can have a well-known time to get started again. Thank you for the reminder.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we have any resolved action items. And we do. And they're both opening discussion threads. Benji, anything to note about these two that we've got marked as resolved? Open discussioning for structs and a discussion thread for chapter reordering?
They both have been opened. So I think the action of opening them has been completed.
Cool. Thank you for keeping an eye on those. I'll close both of these issues. Apologies, I've not been super active on the discussion threads over the last month. A lot going on in my world, so I've been a little slow, but much appreciated to raise those so that there's active discussion. Okay, in the name of time, I won't dig through the other two links right now, but I may go take a look at them later. Okay, first agenda item, and ideally there, because it should be hopefully a brief discussion, is meeting times and cadence. So I know over the last couple of meetings, we've had some soft discussion about wanting to consider changing the meeting times for some a retelling of the history of this meeting. This meeting started as a 3-hour-long meeting, which was a bit grueling. We didn't always use the full 3 hours, but that was kind of the thought, is that we didn't want to run out of time. So it's better to have the time and not use it than, not have the time and need it. But as cadence kicked up, we actually had a few of them that did go long. And in particular, this made it challenging for folks who where the third hour was really late into the night. And then also we wanted to have a time that was more convenient for Asia Pacific time zones. And that shifted it from, I think this meeting used to start at 9, if I remember correctly. Anyway, we shifted it to 11, hoping that that would both kind of make it not too terrible for the end of the night for folks in Europe, but also early enough that we could catch some of the Asia Pacific time zone. Now that we've been doing this for not quite a full year since we made that change, my sense is that we've kind of failed on both marks. Although, I don't know, our European attendees are still here. Thank you, but I know it's relatively late in the evening. We certainly have not had any attendance from Asia Pacific. I think part of the diagnosis there was we made this change in the middle of, can't remember what you call it, in daylight savings time or outside of daylight savings time. Either way, whatever the time zones are in the winter. And because of how northern and southern hemisphere shifts work, like the combined shift is like 2-hour swing. So it used to be a not necessarily convenient, but doable, like 5 or 6 a.m. start time for Asia, all of a sudden shifted to 3 or 4 a.m. for Asia in the summer, which put it right back into the sort of non-viable slot. So that bit of context of what led to the last change, followed by recent discussion about our meetings have been going way too long and we've overflowed and lost agenda items. And also a desire to kind of speed up the cadence a bit. Like we actually have healthy updates faster than month by month, which is great to see. I opened discussion shortly after that last month's meeting with a couple of ideas, just asking for everyone to kind of toss in their mood. And thank you to Alex, who suggested that, maybe the right way to think about this is actually increase cadence rather than just changing time or adding an overflow day. And that's actually where the majority of folks preferred. So I want to kind of run with that. And I actually have a proposal here. So I just added this at the beginning or just like right before the meeting started. So I'll just read through it briefly. But the idea is to shift this to Wednesdays. I saw a couple of comments. I'm curious to hear from folks if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but a couple of comments suggesting that if we had an overflow time, that we would want to shift to a Wednesday, Thursday rather than a Thursday, Friday, because Friday would be really hard for folks. So shifting to a Wednesday, hopefully that makes timing better for folks. And doing weekly meetings, but alternating between what would be West Coast US mornings, and that would be therefore a little bit earlier for East Coast US, and then also earlier for Europe. And then in the alternate weeks to do evening West Coast US, which would be hopefully still late-ish, but doable for East Coast. Probably not very doable for Europe, although bless anyone who decides to show up for that. But it would be much more viable for Asia Pacific. It would be in the sort of like early morning for Sydney and Japan. That ends up being also tightening them. So if we're going to do them more frequently, then we can afford to shorten the meeting a little bit to 1.5 hours, I think was a suggestion I saw in the thread. I thought that was smart. So my pitch here is 9:30 a.m. to 11 Pacific time, which maps to noon 30 New York time, 5:30 p.m. London time, 6:30 p.m. Zurich time. And on the opposite ones, 3:30 to 5 West Coast Pacific, which is hopefully not too late, of 6:30 p.m. New York time. And that maps to 8:30 Sydney time. And then with the time zone shifts, it actually makes the time better for Sydney in the winter rather than so anyway, that's a proposal. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts, comments, suggestions for making this better if you have them.
Lee, I must have missed. I heard the start times, but if we're switching to a weekly cadence, is the length of time being changed? Shortened, I hope.
Shortening to 1.5 hours instead of 2 hours.
I see.
And
Thank
my hope is that if we are increasing the frequency, that we would typically end early, but we will see. It could be that we just fill the time each time. But going 1.5 hours means ending at 11 a.m. Pacific, which would end at 2 p.m. New York time, 7 p.m. London time, 8 p.m. Zurich time for the European friendly times, and would end at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. New York time, and then 10 a.m. Sydney time for the Asia Pacific friendly time. Any thoughts, concerns?
No, I think it's good for the GraphQL Java guys because they are kind of excluded until now, and this re-invites them.
Where they are? Just interesting. They are kind of.
The GraphQL Java guys are not in Sydney, in Gold Coast. I will meet him this year because I'm on a conference down in Sydney, and we will meet up there. But they are located, I think it's Gold Coast, he told me, in Australia.
Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a great idea. Anything we can do to make it easier for more people across the globe to be able to attend is awesome.
What if we do something like this? So 24 hours, there are 3 kind of intervals, 8 hours. Is it possible to figure out these 3 spots so that none of them falls into the night for anybody? Like 10 p.m., next spot is 6 p.m., 6 a.m., and the next spot is 2 p.m., right? And somehow, so looks like comfortable whenever you more or less comfortable for now. Yeah, 6 a.m. a bit early. No. But and then assign, you know, or maybe rotating something like this in one of the spots so everybody has some inconvenience once a month.
I mean, it is like alternating. So it's every week, and then every odd week is Australian time. Every even week, as I understand, is kind of European time friendly. Although I will, since I'm working late anyway, so I will be able to join both of them.
Yeah, and I also think we need to be sensitive to the chair's time here, because if we have 3 time slots, I don't think Lee would be able to attend all 3 of those.
Yeah, selfishly, I'm planning this so that I can attend as many of them as possible. But I think it's not unreasonable for me to delegate a co-chair. That's not something we've had to do, but if we needed to do that to make more times work, I'd be happy to discuss that too. I think the one thing to flag maybe is the day change. I know that since this has historically been on Thursdays, people have carved that time out for a long time. So the shift to Wednesdays, if that makes things net easier or net harder, is like also a reasonable thing to talk about. Benji, I saw your flag about Wednesday evenings being a potential problem.
Yeah, Thursdays are generally free for me. Wednesdays generally busy.
Cool. That one was a bit of a left field curveball, so I'm totally happy to stick with the Thursday plan. Although the one thing that might make that tricky is that there's also the GraphQL board meeting, which happens on Thursday mornings, which right now we've got set up to be alternating weeks. So if I can figure out how to do that so that it slots in the week that doesn't have the morning meeting, then I think we'll be good. But
we also have the composite schema group, right? Sorry.
Yeah, we can just move that to another time, or possibly day. Yeah, we'll have to figure it out.
We can also do this asynchronously probably, but the TSC, what it means for what counts as a TSC quorum, so that we can actually like approve changes to the spec and or like things that need TSC vote that need quorum. This interacts, and so we have to decide like right now we only expect it require a TSC member to show up once every 3 months. And now they'll either need to show up once every 3 weeks, or we need to establish like one of the monthly meetings to be the official TSC meeting. Either of those are fine. I'd be happy with the once every 3 weeks, but whatever.
Okay, good flag. Yeah, I forgot that those interacted, but thank you for reminding me about that. I'll take a look and make sure it doesn't end up being a unnecessary burden. Okay, so my sense is that we will probably stick to Thursdays since people already have that carved, but the time shifts hopefully make things better for everyone. I'll do a little bit of calendaring to make sure that they don't go colliding with the board meeting and get us something to codify. But it sounds like everyone, I'm not hearing any scary vetoes or anyone saying that this seems like a bad idea. So. All right.
This is effectively taking us from what, 2 hours a month to up to 6 hours a month. So I think it should be good for a while. Hopefully, if we keep the meetings to around an hour in general and have that extra half hour if we need it, I think that should work quite nicely.
That's my sense. Also, knowing that these are flipped on the time zones, I have a feeling that the Asia ones are going to be a little quiet for a while, and that's okay. But I'd rather have them and have them be quiet as like room for people to start showing up where they historically haven't been able to. But yeah, full speed will be more.
How do we manage the agenda? At the moment, we just merge everything in. Do we have then like a stopgap? Okay, this is 1.5 hours. You have to go to the next meeting with that item. Something
probably will. Yeah, we'll just. That's mostly been working. This gives us an opportunity to sort through stuff or punt. And it's not unreasonable to kind of flag if a particular meeting is getting way too heavy.
I guess because it's 6 hours now instead of 2, the hope is it will be enough for current topics.
Yeah.
1.5 hours. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it may make sense to have a rough rule of thumb that if your agenda item gets bumped from one meeting for time, that you are prioritized for the following meeting that you can attend.
Yeah.
I think that's just like a easily stated rule that we can abide by, which will keep it easy to merge agenda and also easy to flag the things that need to rise to the top. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit more than 5 minutes, but very helpful feedback. So thank you for that. I'll also make sure that when we get this in place and running, that there's like ample room so that anyone who needs to kind of move calendars around will have time to do that. Okay, I will hand things over to Benji to give us an update about GraphQL over HTTP.
Cool. I'll try and keep this super quick because I know Ivan wants to say something. We have, as promised last month, we have made the edits to the GraphQL over HTTP draft specification. We've also agreed as a subcommittee to raise it to our stage 1. What we would like is to effectively get the main working group's approval to sign this off to stage 2. And ideally, we want to ship it at some point. So there is the GraphQL over HTTP repository under the GraphQL Foundation that you can have a look at. We do also have the spec MD set up, so it now compiles and has a hosted website, much like the GraphQL spec itself. There are some styling issues, which I'm discussing with Lee, so don't worry too much about those. But other than that, it's basically in place. Dennis has prepared us a full reference implementation that he's written from scratch. So that is available for you to have a look at. That's available, is linked in the agenda. Also, we aren't expecting this to break any. We're not expecting this to break the majority of existing GraphQL servers. So Express GraphQL should already be compatible, at least with the musts. Maybe not with the shoulds, but at least with the musts. And I think the same is true of Apollo server. I believe they already comply with all of the musts. There are some shoulds that they do not plan to support, but that's okay. There's decisions they've made around that, which I think are fine. So yeah, please go give it a read and give us your feedback. Ivan.
It's like, I think it can be handled asynchronously. I just like initially I proposed application GraphQL as a MIME type, and now it's used only for response, and it's like confusing. We have application GraphQL as GraphQL language, but application GraphQL plus JSON as response, but it's like technical thing. So I will describe. I spent like half a day today looking through MIME RFCs. So I'm like, now I'm summarizing it. I think it can be discussed asynchronously, just to know that.
There was reason for that, Ivan. In the beginning, like if we cannot just introduce a MIME type, that has to be
no, I suggest different MIME types, just like in different name.
Okay.
I look into MIME database and what people actually using, like some protocols are actually using, and it's official MIME types. It's like application GraphQL dash response. It's in my database, and it's make more sense because it's a representation of response, not a representation of a query or HDL file. So it's like technical thing. I actually figure out how to apply to MIME type, so I'm feeling an issue to apply. Like we can actually officially register it. Not a big deal for a spec, just like a note that I will try to submit as fast as possible to not have like breaking changes along the lines, or like better chance to improve it. Yeah.
Thank you for this update. My sense is that because this is a companion spec, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to have it go through the stages, because we're not adding it to the main spec proper. But there is sort of a discoverability problem that we ought to solve. We've had a discussion of having many companion specs, this one being the most important, and we ought to have a place that just lists out all of the specs, including the core one. And I think that's just kind of an open question that we need to figure out, but it would be great to get this hosted under spec.graphql.org.
Okay, great. That was one of our questions, really, was should we have the main working group actually advance it through the stages, or because I think we'll still stage the changes, but is it just entirely managed by the subcommittee, or does it need to escalate up? Obviously, we'll try and keep everyone in the loop.
I like a model where a subcommittee gets to own this, because it allows you to move faster. Should we get into a mode where this is also like on the early phase where nothing abides the spec yet, but you have a number of people in the subcommittee group who are owners of or close to well-used HTTP services. So I think like the mode we're in now is to try to get corral the ecosystem together and then set some guidelines for that via the spec. And if we can make it easier to find the spec, it'll make it easier for us to do that phase. Eventually we'll get into a mode where most people are using it, and we'll start to encounter problems or gaps or inconsistencies or what have you. And then if it makes sense to have more of a formality around how we approve things, then that's fantastic. But my sense is like, as long as a subcommittee is in general consensus that a decision is the right one, then like giving this larger group updates rather than asking for decisions to be made is probably the right model.
Okay.
There's one other question on this is like, okay, if the subcommittee owns that, when we in the subcommittee think, so we want to release that as this is done, should the TSC vote on that or?
Yeah, that is a great question. I will double check how our sort of legal guidelines work around that, but I'm pretty sure the right way to model that is everyone who's contributed to that spec needs to have gone through the CLA. And then when we actually do a cut, then we'll have to do a TSC vote to ratify it. And that those two things basically say like, A, everyone who's contributed has contributed under the same guidelines so that it can be free to use. And that the TSC has approved the final edited doc. But it's cool for it to kind of live in draft mode as long as you need it to in order to get it to that point. But I think so the important point for now is to like make sure that the CLAs are in place, because that was what caused the last main spec cut to take so long, was we had to go chase down everyone in the commit history and like go get CLAs from them.
One other quick question here. Does this mean that, well, GraphQL.js is the reference implementation of the GraphQL spec. Does this mean Express GraphQL will become the reference implementation for this spec, or is that not determined?
Actually, yeah, kind of. There is Enzo, who also specified the GraphQL WS protocol, who writes now an implementation from scratch that just implements the GraphQL over HTTP spec. If Express GraphQL or this new from scratch thing becomes reference implementation is not yet defined, but there should be something that we can point people to.
Got it. Yeah, I was just bringing up Express GraphQL because I think it's technically owned by the GraphQL Foundation right now. So it might be the right pick there. I don't know, but yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I think if there is going to be a reference implementation, it will be Express GraphQL. At the moment, though, no one has updated it, and Dennis has done the work to give a new implementation of it. But this is going to get more interesting when we start expanding the GraphQL over HTTP to cover server-sent events and WebSockets, which obviously Express GraphQL does not support currently. So yeah, there's definitely some decisions to be made as time progresses, but we don't need to worry about those right now.
Sounds good.
I think we're good to move on. The next agenda item managed to slip in there without attribution. I'm not sure how, but Solomon has actually reached out to me and said he can't make it tonight. So this one will have to be skipped.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, to just close the book on the HTTP spec update, that last bit of reference implementation, I am happy to follow whatever recommendation y'all want to have, though I think it probably is the right thing to have the reference implementation managed under the foundation. So if we need to do any like repo move shenanigans, we'll make that happen. But I like the idea of having sort of like a core that is not beholden to Express or Koa or any one of the sort of framework level pieces as being the reference implementation. It seems like a nice property to have, but nice work on this so far, everyone. This is really kind of stellar progress over a very short amount of time. Props.
One quick question, Lee. You said it's probably a good thing for the reference implementation to be managed or owned by the working group here, but would we say, and I'm thinking of all sub specs, would it be correct to say that it's a requirement that the reference implementation be owned by this group?
I think that's probably a safe thing to require. I think the problem or the failure mode that I would like to avoid is one where we mark a particular repo as the sort of blessed reference implementation that we guide people to understand the reference between code and spec. And then for whatever reason, that person goes rogue or we lose access to it or something. And then all of a sudden we end up in a broken state. And so we don't want to end up in that position. It also makes it easier from a legal point of view to like guide contribution and licensing and that sort of thing. I would say like those aren't necessarily, they don't have to be strict requirements, but would certainly make it far less possible for us to end up in that failure mode if we make sure that the reference implementation projects are hosted by us. Usually the trade-off for that is the folks who've contributed the lion's share of work to it want to retain maintainer access, and we've got playbooks for that. So hopefully we can keep that going. Okay, so we're skipping over the parsing stress testing. Hopefully we can talk about that again at a next meeting, which means Benji, you get a chance to talk about your struct type.
Oh, yes. Okay. The struct type. So at the GraphQL conference a little while ago, I guess that was about 6 weeks ago or so, I did a talk on metadata. I've been thinking about metadata for a few years now. There's that issue thread number 300, which is particularly long. And I did a lot of research into it. I looked into all the different solutions that people were doing. I thought about what all the different problems were, and I was starting to think about what a solution might look like. One of the problems that I kept coming back to, especially when we talk about metadata in the form of directives, is the issue of directives take inputs, introspection gives outputs. How do we mesh these together? And it's a bit of a problem. So I was chatting with Ivan about this after the meeting. We had a very productive conversation, came up with a bunch of different ideas, like complete spitballing, loads and loads of stuff. And I think it was Ivan originally suggested something like this. And I expanded it on what I'd been doing with the one-off, and also with a few things that you've said in the past, Lee. And I thought, maybe this is something. And as I started to think more about it, I realized that actually, if we had a type with these properties being similar to that of an input object. So an input object has fields, those fields have types. The fields don't accept arguments, of course, because they're input. They can also like reference in a chain, but the loop has to be broken at some point. So we have requirements on input objects that there is no infinite chain, and so on. What happens if we were to take a type like that and export it? And it turns out it solves a whole bunch of issues. So anyone who's familiar with the GraphQL introspection query, at least the one that GraphQL produces, will have seen the of type fragment, which goes, I think, 8 layers deep from memory, and is basically the same thing over and over again, 8 layers deep. And what it means is, though GraphQL doesn't actually strictly limit you to having an X-dimensional array, if you go past a certain number of dimensions and non-nulls, then you can't introspect it with GraphQL anymore. And there's things like that. But also, it's just unpleasant to write. Like, we don't want to be writing that, in my opinion. There's various other things where this kind of thing actually happens for people's own schemas. So I had a situation with a table of contents, for example, where actually you want like a deeply nested tree structure that you know will finish, but will represent everything in a particular document. Think of a H1 headings all the way down to maybe H6 or even further. You want all of that stuff to come through. And if someone adds another level, you don't want your application to break because it's not requesting that extra level. People have solved this by using things like a JSON scaler or things like that to grab an object like that. But then, of course, you lose typing. There are, of course, also ways where you turn a tree into a list pull it down as a list and then turn it back into a tree on the client. But one of the main things about GraphQL is giving data to the client in the shape that is useful to the client. So having the client have to transform again afterwards is not really aligned with GraphQL's goals, I would say. Another thing that is commonly requested is the wildcard selection on GraphQL. Now, there's many, many good reasons that we don't have this in GraphQL. The main one of which being that it would break, or one of the main ones, it means that we can't safely add fields because it's now going to effectively affect all previous clients. And that makes sense for most things, especially when we've got arguments, when we're returning deep nested object trees that may ultimately be recursive, when we've got things that might be deprecated and so on and so forth. But if you think about something that has structure and yet you want to treat it as a scalar, that is really the core of this idea. So one example of this would be GIS data. So if you've ever used GeoJSON for representing things on a map, a GeoJSON it has a bunch of different shapes, polygons and so on, and it has the coordinates, and it can also have additional properties. And you may want to strongly type these, and when you pull down a GeoJSON node, you want the entire GeoJSON node, but you also want to know that it has a description and what those properties are going to be in a type-safe way. So there's a absolute whole host of issues that this solves. I have written up an RFC, so you can read through this in more detail, and maybe slower, in the struct markdown file in the RFCs folder in the GraphQL working group. One of the other things that it potentially solves is polymorphism, and it actually harkens back to one of the other solutions that we originally mooted for input unions, which was effectively adding type name to input objects. And we decided in the end that that wasn't the route we wanted to go. But if we were to add these structs to output as well as having them on input, then actually that symmetry there may make that solution more desirable. So I experimented with this as potentially replacing scalar, replacing an input object, or being a new type called struct. And in the end, and I've explained this in the document, the best route does seem to be to basically have it be the input objects become struct and get this ability to come through output as well. So we'll have to get over the fact that it's called input and just roll with it. One other really interesting thing that we could do with this, and this is kind of optional but also desired, if you think of a scalar at the moment, like a JSON scalar, you request it and that's it in GraphQL. You request the one thing, you don't give it a selection set, and we just pull it down for you, the entire thing. Now, sometimes with these kind of atomic pieces of data, like a GeoJSON node, for example, that's what you want. You want to pull down the whole thing. Sometimes you actually only want a sub-selection of it, and there's no way to do that with GeoJSON. So one of the particularly interesting things that I'm suggesting here is that we give this thing the ability to optionally accept selection sets. Now, these selection sets would be a little bit different from our normal selection sets in that they will not obviously have arguments because these fields don't support arguments, and thus they will not need aliases, and they should not have aliases. And as such, the merging of the selection sets for them should be really, really easy. If something requests field A, something requests field B, and something requests the whole object, we just get the whole object because that satisfies all three of those different selection sets. So that is particularly interesting when it comes to metadata. It's also interesting for things like the GeoJSON, because you could say, I just want the coordinates and I don't care about the attributes. There's a whole bunch of things that that's useful for. So here's my interesting idea, which does put a few things on its head. I wanted to collect anyone's thoughts. Hopefully people may have had a look at it since I raised it at the last or intended to raise it at the last working group, but it was punted. So yeah, let me know what you think.
I remember we talked about something similar when we were, because we had this sort of branched path when we were talking about input unions of doing essentially a struct type or the one of. And for due diligence, and also because it was interesting, we were following the struct type that could be used in input output forms, and eventually decided that it had too many, like it broke both forward and backwards compatibility, if I remember correctly. Like there was a bunch of cases where you could paint yourself into a corner. Have we found a way to avoid those concerns, or are we going to end up sort of rehashing that same thread of thought?
I don't remember those specific concerns. I have thought about it a fair amount, and I think we can avoid most of them. One of the things is whether the dunder type name field is required or not. For example, if we replace input with this struct type, then obviously it needs to be backwards compatible. So dunder type name wouldn't be required unless you were using it as part of an input union. But in that case, of course, you're using it as part of an input union. So therefore, it would be supported. That does mean that you wouldn't be able to upgrade an input object in your schema to suddenly be a union of input objects. But that I don't think is a major concern. And I honestly, I think most of the other things probably are fine. But I'll have to refresh myself on what those problems were.
Yeah, I can provide some context. Sorry, Roman, because it's connected. So to finish like a chain.
Okay.
Basically, it's not about like type selection. It's about this type that became a frozen type. Basically, if we add any non-nullable field, it means it's required to provide it. So imagine you have geo coordinates, and recently, don't ask why, but I look into coordinates and I figure out actually like Ukraine have its own local coordinate systems. So, and it's really makes sense to provide unified GPS coordinates and like Ukrainian local coordinates if it's like localized business. And Ukrainian local coordinates, it's non-nullable because you can always convert, but you cannot add them. So if you basically, if you can do in unions of stuff, but yeah, basically like even without example of coordinates, you cannot add non-nullable stuff anymore. Deprecate is weird. You cannot, if you deprecate, it's mean like you deprecated input and output at the same time, but usually in the system you want to deprecate output, and only after people stop using it, you deprecate input. And it's not possible here. Also, I expect people like, yeah, since it's frozen type and people like asterisk functionality. So a lot of first-time GraphQL people will just use it all over the place, and when they cannot migrate away from basically a frozen schema. Yeah, we can migrate at top level or like near the top level.
We could enable migration if we kept input struct and output struct as two different things. And because structs are structural, presumably I can pass any struct that is a superset of the input struct in, and I can provide any struct that is a subset with all the required fields of an output struct to the like resolver on the server.
you cannot change type names. So we fix it to type names. And
yeah. So this would yeah.
Yeah, last comment, if we have two different types, it's basically defeat purpose of heterogeneous thing. You cannot later split it. If you create one type, you cannot split it. But if you create two separate types, like we can solve the same problem other way around. We can introduce like some form of like asterisk or some form of recursive fragments to the same solution. So main proposal in my view is like, can we do it heterogeneous, both input and output at the same time? Sorry, and switch to Roman.
So guys, I want to make a quick comment about that aliases are not needed if you don't have arguments. Actually, aliases still would be very helpful if you want to return it, would change names to easily serialize into some object, predefined object on the client side. You know, sometimes it's useful. The serialized, the keys in JSON sometimes differ. They don't conform to certain language, you know, standards of the property names. So it's normal to have, some attribute or something to change automatically the keys versus the property names. And so to make it easy, you can provide aliases for some fields in this return JSON so that they can easily fit into the deserialized object, right? So this was some quick comment regarding aliases. They still might be allowed. They still might be useful. So in general, I would say that I'm all for it. I think this thing finally might solve so many problems that actually are in practice out there. So, and even if we had some unresolved issues, with these kind of things in the past, so screw it, we have to solve these issues, and we actually have no choice. That's kind of my opinion. I have a question. So basically, probably it's a chance to also think about map and untyped object. Types, scalars, or something like this, because this is also kind of a close, seems like the same theme. And again, in practice, it would be very beneficial because the entire world is not strongly typed. Sometimes you have mixed types somewhere. So although I'm all for strong types, but the reality is sometimes somewhere you need it. So map and untyped object any, I would say map and any. Would it be appropriate to bring this into the context? And final question, since it looks about input objects, it looks like the scope, the time scope of this feature is way beyond October, but maybe we can do one small thing, long asked to allow return input objects. It looks like it will be as part of this particular effort, bigger effort. It will be, we will allow it. So maybe separately in October release, we will just allow it and treat input objects as kind of subtypes or restricted types of object types. Because I think technically nothing prevents us simply to returning input objects. And it is often the situation when you have some simple object, just bunch of properties, simple strings, integers, and so on. And you want to send it to the server or receive it to the server. But you have to duplicate them. One type as type and another type as input type. So basically, maybe we can just allow it finally in this release as a separate change. That's it.
All right, that was a lot of feedback. Thank you, everyone. Let me try and address some of these things. So I've written down a list of a few of them, and let me address them one by one. So first was Ivan raising the non-null issue. So another use case for this, GeoJSON's one. Another one is things like prose mirror documents and things like that, where you're editing nodes. In those cases, those are generally things that you want to pull down from the GraphQL schema. You want to modify them somehow, and then you want to send them back to the GraphQL schema. So one of the things that you can think of with the struct in particular, by marking, think of it as like input blah at struct for now. It's a specially tagged input type that you've said, I want it to be used in this particular way. And the particular way is this: you always pull it down from GraphQL, you can do something to it, and then you send it back. So in the case of creation, where the non-nullability would cause problems, you may well do the creation with some other API that allows you to add more fields that are non-nullable later that the server will backfill. But for the main operation, pull it down, do something with it, send it back. The addition of non-nullable fields isn't a concern, because you pull down the whole object, it's got those fields. Even if you don't understand them, when you send it back to the server, it still has them. So that isn't necessarily a concern, but you have to, when you have to opt into treating an input object as a struct. It can't be an accident. It must be something you opt into. And when you do so, you are saying, I'm using this data in this particular way. As for aliases, which Roman raised, if we allow aliases, it basically breaks that ability that I just described, the ability to pull things down, do stuff with them and send them back. If you've got different selection sets that add aliases, now you potentially overwrite other fields or you cause other problems. So basically, it's just not compatible with what the desire of the spec is. So yes, it would be convenient in certain circumstances, but actually it undermines a very significant amount of the feature of the spec. So I don't think we can allow them, and you'll just have to rename those fields on the client side. Map and untyped, I think those are separate. We may be able to add them afterwards. At the moment, struct can have any scalar, other struct, or list thereof included in it. So if we also allow things like map and any in general, then those hopefully would be able to be made in a compatible way as well. And as Matt said, maybe this is putting the rest back into GraphQL. Nice sus there, Matt. Actually, one of the motivating things, not one that I'm dealing with myself, but one that I have seen in the issues, is people dealing with put requests in HTTP as opposed to patch requests. And in those cases, you do pull something down, you don't know what it is, you know what bits of it are, you fiddle with those and you send it back. So yeah, this can actually deal with the put problem of HTTP while still doing it in a GraphQL way. I think one of the biggest issues, honestly, that this introduces is that it makes it uncertain, potentially, when you should use an object type versus when you should use a struct. I think that is honestly the biggest problem. And the answer is, if you don't know which one you should be using an object type. The struct has a very specific use case, and we're going to have to be careful to guide people towards it. So I am very aware of that as one of the major problems with it. But I still think that the benefits outweigh that cost. Was there any other questions that I didn't address?
I see Stephen.
Allowing input. Maybe I missed something, but allowing input to be used as output.
That is the struct.
But
The
ahead.
struct is an input that is allowed to be an output.
Yeah, but what I meant, because this is kind of long-term, what we're doing here, but just allowing it short-term right in the October spec. without struct?
Someone would need to raise a separate RFC for that, and I think it's unlikely that it would get merged in time for the October spec, but we could try.
Okay. Because the generally idea is okay at the end, right? Because it will be fully implemented with struct, right? So why not?
So there's a lot to like about this proposal. It addresses like some complaints we often hear about, like, oh why inputs and outputs have to be separate and all that. But I do want to provide a glimpse into the future of when this is adopted. So at Netflix, we've used for a long time a very similar protocol called Falcor, and it has a type called an atom, which is basically a struct. And one thing that we have observed is that sometimes things end up all getting piled into that. To the UI teams call them summary atoms, and then you do end up with like parts of the graph that are like basically this rest blob that just kind of grows. And so addressing early the ambiguity of when to use this, I think would be pretty key for healthy graphs in the ecosystem.
Yeah, maybe we can rename it from struct to blob. That will make people less motivated to actually use it, only as a last resort.
I'm gonna wrap this one up so we can have a break, time shifted by 10 minutes. My advice to move this forward is to back up from the proposal to redefine the problem. I know like this ended up being extremely clarifying when we talked about input unions, because we were in the weeds on the details of a particular approach, and backing up and defining the problem really helped us map out the space. I agree. There's a lot to like about this. I'm also worried that this is relitigating some of the things that we determined wouldn't work in those past discussions. If we can solve for them, great. But the other thing that makes me a bit nervous is that this is reading a bit like a panacea, where it's solving the metadata problem and also the input union problem. And then also like there's just a bunch of problems that are being sort of bulleted in together. And I'm worried that in the spirit of trying to find one thing that will solve all problems, we will find each of those problems inadequately solved. That's just a high level concern. I need to think more about it. But I want to make sure that in carefully defining the problems that we're trying to solve here, we can prove to ourselves that what we're onto is the right path. Cool. Thank you, Benji, for leading that. Super interesting. Let's take a quick break and come back at 12 past. I think it's a roughly 5-minute break. All right. Hopefully people returned quickly. Next up on our agenda is GraphQL definition and the role of SDL. Roman, this is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start. This is a short presentation. I'll try to bring back the attention to the old discussion, already old, and quite important problem. So again, we have essentially two definitions in the spec. What is GraphQL? And both are, I think, unsatisfactory, quite unsatisfactory, unclear. And during the discussion of the suggestion, there was even opinion that it's all like empty talk. It doesn't matter. You know, GraphQL is something. It's different for everybody. Well, I think it is the opposite. If we define something, if we build something, we must clearly define what exactly we build. And again, the core of my suggestion is GraphQL is a client-server communication protocol. And now let's go next. This actually is important for us as well. It's important for potential readers and for us as well, to help us focus and to understand what is our target domain, what things we want to specify. So basically, I think our own expertise and experience influence what we put into the spec, and sometimes not in the right way. So here is a very simple diagram So our own expertise is client, communication, channel HTTP, and server. And we also, many of us are very familiar with internals of some GraphQL implementations, servers and clients. And it kind of shows up and influences what we put into the spec. And the question is, what should be target domain? Let's explicitly ask this: what should be the concern of the spec? And I think it is communication channel. Basically, what's on the wire, or what's in the communication, what goes between client and server. And again, client and server understood in general way. It can be sometimes client and server running the same domain and running the same server process, and it's just direct call. But in my definition, the target should be only communication definitions. So what's on the wire? And we should not presume that our readers have the same any knowledge outside of this. Of course, they would know something about programming and APIs and so on. Some of them would know just client side client programmers, some of them server side, and definitely we should not presume that they know some implementations of GraphQL. Why is it important? I would like to give you some example. There was a late, quite heated discussions there actually around my PR. Look at this fragment of the spec. There are 2 paragraphs there, 2 sentences. And for me, it looks like the second one, likewise, and so on. It says the same thing. From the point of view of it says, you can omit the schema. The second one, the only difference I see, it should be omitted. Okay, and that's it. So after the discussion, here is what I was, for example, the explanation that I'm getting. When GraphQL schema is represented with SDL, and now you see when you do print schema in GraphQL GS or equivalent, it means that this is about certain implementations, the server-side implementations that can generate schemas. And so essentially this second sentence says that the server-side software should generate schema in this way. Unlike in general, like if you write the schema manually and design it. And then my question is why it says about server-side, why the schema even mentions the server-side implementation. Second, why it tells it how to do things. If for example, I have a server implementation and I do generate the schema on demand, and I consider it valid in the terms of the first sentence, why the spec suddenly says that if you do automatically generate it, then you should do it this way. You should omit while you could omit. This is one thing. The second thing, which is more disturbing, is that to understand this second statement, you actually have to kind of have some knowledge about something on the server side and how things work inside the server, which I think is a completely wrong assumptions that the user, the reader, would know something about it. That's essentially my concern with this, and it's illustration of how it happened that we actually lose focus of what should be in the spec and what concepts, what things we can use there, or which background references. So again, we should change the definition, formal definition. It's a communication protocol. One thing, we get in line with other similar tech, essentially, that like gRPC, 3-hour, and so on, they define communication, not the implementation. not the options for schema generating, for automatically generating clients or servers. So basically, this clear definition will actually guide us and restrict us to what we actually talk about in the spec. And an important thing, we really have a lot of things to kind of discuss. There are a lot of requests. We have enough work to do already. And that will actually clearly cut the work and define well what we should do. Again, we will presume readers have no knowledge on clients or server side and GraphQL frameworks as well. And regarding SDL, again, in line with its definitions, interface definition language, if we declare it in the spec, then we will make it interface definition language. It defines the communication protocol, essentially all you need to know to communicate successfully with other parties. And that's it. It's not about automatically generating client code or server code. If you have this generated, good for you. But it's not the concern of the spec. Thank you. And I would like to invite back to this discussion, and go along kind of the line that I suggest, that the definition is important. The definition of role SDL is important. And we need to push it as, clarify these things as soon as possible. I think it is really important. Thank you.
I see a bunch of comments in the chat, but maybe people want to raise their hand in Zoom. That way we can go through folks one at a time. I think Tim won the hand race, so Tim, go for it.
Just wanted to understand from an ideological or from a principles-based approach, you motivated that, but I just want to understand what disadvantages we have on a practical level if this is mentioned in the spec.
One of the strange things we have two definitions of what is GraphQL, and both are unsatisfactory. Both don't make sense. The first definition is GraphQL is a language for creating client applications, which is really strange. What is it, like React or something? There is a client application without a server. And second is something like this. It's a language and execution engine, although we don't ship any engines. So basically, the initial motivation, let's clear it up. And second, let's specify then it automatically gives us the focus or defines the domain that what is the concern of the entire spec, what's there and what's not there. That's the motivation.
Yakov, I think you had your hand up next. Go for it.
Sure. I think there's a lot to be said, generally speaking, for refining the definition of GraphQL. I'm not sure, as it's used in the spec document. I guess we should A, be consistent, and B, there's always room for improvement when describing anything. But it's tough. Maybe we'll never hit the exact perfect. So I would generally agree with that. I would say I think I'm going to be. I think maybe some others might say it better, but I think it's true that the specification doesn't specifically ship an engine, but an execution engine, but it certainly ships a specification of execution that's implemented by certain engines. So I'm not sure what the better English language equivalent would be. And the last thing I would say is that, and I guess it's a more narrow discussion, but the exact relationship between or slightly different angle of what Roman was saying and important is I do think it's important to define the role of SDL and the schema. My sense of it, certainly not being anywhere near things when they were created or added to the spec, is that right now we have introspection a document that basically there is a one-to-one correspondence between introspection and the schema itself, and everything can be represented in SDL except sort of the function, that execution stuff. And it might be worth the resolvers, it might be worth explaining that. But saying that the two are identical sort of ties our hands. If we find something further, some other category that can't be represented in text, and maybe that's the hesitation of saying the two are identical. Factually speaking, they're not identical. We may want them to be identical, but it's certainly, and maybe we want the spec, maybe there could be like some language. But that particular example, I think, in terms of converting between one direction to another, I think is fairly straightforward. There's an entity that, that we're specifying, and then there's the textual representation of that entity. And you do need to convert back and forth, and there's differences in normative approach to that when converting back and forth in terms of standardization. So I think that part makes sense. But in general, I would support continuous improvement, but I'm not sure what the language in particular that I would agree with.
I can give a little bit of context into the background of why things are the way they are now, which is introspection was the original way and still the preferred way to fetch the schema from us. If you are a user of a service, that is the way in which you get the schema from that service. And then the SDL actually historically was a way to talk about it. Like it was a tool that people used. And there was a lot of demand for sort of codifying how to do that. And then there was a bunch of tooling that wanted to rely on it. And so it was sort of added in a way that was like not really about this communication layer at all. So the discussion between a user of a service and a service doesn't actually use the SDL, which is part of the reason why it's a little bit kind of floating in the spec rather than being grounded in that core reason or that core original purpose. But it still is proven to be fairly valuable to be there nonetheless. But I agree that it could be helpful to articulate that there are a couple goals to that spec that rather than a single goal. I think the first and foremost goal is, I don't know that I would frame it exactly the way you have, Roman. I think it's not necessarily about the communication. I think that is more in the space of the sort of GraphQL over HTTP spec is more about that communication bridge and how that works on a fundamental level, and more about as an abstract user of a service, like what is your perception of that service? What properties must it abide by? And then the secondary one is then how do you talk about these schemas and model them and iterate on them, which is where the SDL, IDL space has ended up being quite useful.
Let me kind of respond to this. Again, I understand there are historical accidents and the things were added and created in organic way. And it evolved into something really valuable. I want to bring up again perspective of the newcomer, as I was 3 years ago, and what people start to associate, like directives, the attribute annotations. SDL, DL, we are saying ideal, and people may know some other examples of this. And this they start because there is a direct association of things. For example, SDL, it is actually the definition of the problem. And but suddenly they are met with the surprises. No, it's like this. I understand there is a historical explanation, but there are reasons actually to bring it with the expectations, and not only expectations, the way usually they work in other frameworks. For example, the ideal is the definition, and SDL and introspection should be equivalent. Expectation is it's the same, only SDL for humans to read it and introspection for tools. and this is great, it works, and all this contradiction that by the informational content is not the same. This is very surprising. And again, you have to bring up the historical reasons for this involving. I think there is a good reason to bring it up in currently, and this kind of mostly disregard the historical reasons why it appeared.
For sure, I can totally agree with that. Hopefully the history is helpful for this group in particular to help us guide decisions, but I'm with you. As a new reader of the spec, you should be able to make your way through it and understand its purpose. That seems like a very viable goal.
Thank you. Then again, some of the things you read in the spec, like the example I brought up, it's impossible to understand the new reader, and you have to bring in kind of the things, examples from the server or some historical things. And this I think should be improved.
So I know we're coming up on the 20-minute mark for this agenda item. I want to make sure that we end with something actionable. I think the broad stroke of what you're suggesting here, Roman, is on point, which is there is confusion as you read through. That confusion is in roughly two buckets. One bucket being sort of in the tactics and the details. There's places where we phrase things in ways that could be clearer. And we should be cataloging those and fixing them. So you had a screenshot of one that looks ripe for an improvement, where we sort of repeat ourselves with lack of clarity around what the actual expectation is. We should fix that. I love that. I think that's been actually the lion's share of the changes that have made it into the spec in the last couple of years have been things that make the spec easier to read and make it less ambiguous, more clear. So that's one category. The second category is sort of this overall understandability. Like, what is the purpose of it? What is its domain? I think, as is in the chat, and I broadly agree with the rough chorus of the chat, that I don't necessarily agree with the pitch that you've given us as to what the primary purpose of the domain of the spec should be. I think the domain of the spec should be, as an observer of a service, what should you be able to see that service doing and how should you interact with it, which includes communication but goes broader than that. But I think it's the main point there that a new reader of the spec will find themselves confused because we don't make it very clear what that domain is a problem that we ought to solve. So I don't know if that's enough to hopefully get us to something actionable. Hopefully that first category of things is actionable. As we see these, at a minimum, we should be flagging them as issues so that we can churn through them and fix them with editorial. If there's improvements to be made, then pull requests are even better. Let's keep churning on those, because the more of those we can fix, the easier it is will be to read. The second one feels like it needs something closer to what will get group consensus.
But my main question is, as for the definition, just the statement, I will agree that something like this, GraphQL is a client-server communication protocol, would work.
It is not. Like a good term that Lee used in the user group recently is GraphQL is a coordination layer. And that actually is what the main GraphQL engine is, right? It's not about communication. That is what the GraphQL HTTP spec is trying to solve, describing the communication between clients and servers over HTTP.
It's transport. There is transport and there's communication protocol on top of the transport, right?
Right.
And communication protocol is that the request text should be like this, then the response in JSON. This is called protocol. What is? It's not simply language. Yeah. It's just the language. Yeah, right.
But the GraphQL main spec is also about execution behavior.
And that's my big question. Why? Because I why you
It's about
dictate me how to
guarantees.
execute what?
Yeah, given a particular request, two services which provide the same schema and abide by the same GraphQL defined behavior should give you the same result given the same request. If not,
Exactly.
then it becomes really difficult to build tools and to build client libraries and all the rest. So you need a definition of execution that is detailed enough so that clients know what to expect and servers know how to produce those expected results. That's the main purpose of the execution section. I think we'd be in trouble if we didn't have that. We would introduce a lot of ambiguity. Even if there's a lot of room for us in spec land, right? Like we can have a philosophy of state the minimum viable spec. Like if we state something that is not normative, then we could have a policy that says we have no non-normative references, right? We don't go above and beyond what is officially observable or not observable. To this point, we have not had that principle. We've actually had sort of the flip side where we try as much as possible to contextualize normative statements. There's a lot of non-normative stuff in the spec. It makes it longer, but the goal of that is to make it easier to read for two general audiences, a consumer, a user of GraphQL. So whether that's someone who's building the Apollo client or someone who's using a client-side tool. And then there's certain parts of the spec that feel sort of egregious, but that's for the second audience, which is someone who is implementing a service. If you're building a GraphQL service, then you want to be able to look to the spec and say, hey, if I'm building out this particular piece of the introspection engine or the execution engine or the validation engine, what is the appropriate behavior? And the spec very intentionally goes beyond the normative there to provide the algorithms and provide context around how they should work and why. They don't necessarily have to do that. You could just only look at the reference implementation to get a sense of that. But so far, that's been quite helpful. But I think to the sense of where is it that we should state the domain, which I think like Michael, Roman, you guys are both saying things that are accurate here, which is like, A, we should be crisp about what the purpose of the normative statements in the spec are. And there's both a spec reader, spec for the spec people sort of take on that, which is like, is it or is it not inclusive of the transports? And is it fair to call it client server, or is it bigger or broader than that? It's like, yes, but also a casual reader and a first time reader is going to come to this with the language of, I have an iOS app and I hit a server that's built in Python. Like, how am I supposed to move from the practicalities of that world into the abstractions of the spec? And ideally, that is where the overview section helps ground things. And that's why it starts with the statement of, it is designed to be a query language for client applications. It doesn't have to exclusively be that, but that is its original purpose. And the overview is a place where we should be setting the stage. We should help people go from the more common uses of GraphQL in terms of tactically how it gets used, which is, I think we even mentioned JSON a couple of times in that overview. So then tease it out to the spec domain. I think broadly what we have written there probably hasn't changed since we originally wrote the very first draft of the spec. It probably could be improved. That would be my advice as to the best place to clarify this would be in that overview section.
May I then suggest, first of all, I like your term observable. What I'm actually trying to argue here is whatever observable outside the server should be specified. Whatever is the details, how I reach the proper response, and you say there are two implementations and they, with the same query, they should return the same result. I absolutely agree this. It's just the observable part is our concern. Second, in general, guys, if you think that my definition is not appropriate, I'm insisting, but I think then secondly, the existing definitions, for historical reasons, they come up to be, are not satisfactory. Then let's suggest other better things. Maybe it's client server communication and implementation, execution, whatever protocol. But I think this is urgent enough problem to make it better.
I think the main thrust of that is right. And this is what I was saying about the spec having a bit of gray room. Like what I mean by normative statements in this case is exactly what you just framed. What is observable by a GraphQL service? That is the primary domain of what is normative within the spec, because the spec defines how a user of a service perceives that service behaving. And in many cases, it's hard to actually tease out exactly how to do that. And the gray area of the spec is one where we go a little bit above and beyond purely the what is observable, where we write in how to produce that observed result as well. And I think it's probably not a problem that we do that. It doesn't mean that we actually go to some length to express that a server does not need to line for line re-implement the algorithms that we propose, but those illustrate what is an observed behavior. And it's sometimes difficult to draw a cut line through that and only express the pieces that are observable and not the pieces that are not, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to do that cut line. But certainly if we can reduce non-normative pieces in a way that improves clarity, that would be a win. Because the purpose of having the non-normative pieces there, including the non-normative parts of less observable or not observable parts of the algorithm, those are there for clarifying purpose. So if they reduce clarity, then we should improve that. I think that's a reasonable goal. Doing this, I think just like tactically, like how I want to make sure that we end up with something actionable that we can move forward. I do think it is useful to have sort of a set of principles as spec writers here in this audience, that we have a shared goal. I'm happy that you are pursuing this, Roman. I think you can read from the chat that the current framing of that is not quite right. You're getting a lot of pushback in the chat. But I think the purpose here is right, to make sure that we understand the domain, and that there is a lack of clarity of that is a real problem that we ought to solve.
So what's the action?
Actions. So within those two buckets I framed earlier, in the tactics, let's continue to flag those as issues if it's not clear how they should be reworded. Like there is a point of something that is lacking clarity and we don't know how to fix it, therefore issue. There's a point of something that is lacking clarity and we have a good idea of how to fix it, pull request for an editorial change. And then the second category of things, which is defining the domain, it seems like that just needs a better case iteration. My sense is that you've been mostly doing an inwards out mode to this. Like you've had your own personal perspective on what would be improved. You're getting pushback on that. My sense is that means that you need an outside in process where you can pull from folks what they think the domain is and try to get something that is closer to the agreed upon consensus. It seems like the working group has sort of a rough agreed upon sense. We just haven't written it down anywhere. And like arriving at something that we've written down that maps reasonably close to what we've been considering the domain that we're defining is the right place to start. And then we can start to define the problems within that, rather than trying to go only to the idealized end state, which I think is always going to suffer from this case of being any one particular person in this room writing down an idealized end state will not meet the consensus. So it's better to tackle individual problems within our current probably faulty state and addressing those one by one.
Okay. So it's generic recommendation, I guess.
Yep.
No, regarding the small issues, I think you noticed I'm pushing a lot of small issues, which suddenly, some of them meet a lot of resistance in discussion. Okay, we'll continue doing this.
Yes, thank you for
But
raising
still,
those.
guys, let's think about this in general. Forget about our own context, forget about historical, how it grew up. Think about as the existing thing and new reader.
That I strongly agree with. one of our principles should definitely be a new reader of the GraphQL spec should be able to make its way through top to bottom without getting lost or needing to go find a secondary doc or go dig into history. That seems like a very crisp, hopefully everyone agree, principle that we should all have in mind. I like that a lot.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
All right, next up, Yakov, unions with abstract types.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep it pretty brief. This is sort of an update on what we were talking about a few working groups ago, I think. And that was the ability to specify that more types that actually satisfy an interface, that GraphQL is aware of it. So I'm going to try to figure out where I can share my screen, or maybe I'll just, for some reason, I'm not able to. Okay, so for some reason, I'm sorry about that. I can't seem to share my screen, but you have in the agenda the issue, the issue linked and the motivating use case. So if you follow that link, it would be the spec pull request 950 that has that in there. And I'll just paste that into the chat. Sorry about that. But basically, we're trying to, or the goal would be to basically say that that if you have a type that implements a certain interface, it would be okay if one of the fields of that type, implementing an interface, let's say an object type implementing an interface, it would be okay to say that if that field's type is a union, that where all the subtypes, all the members of that union are within a parent union, it would GraphQL would currently recognize this. So right now, the only types that can fulfill a union that are considered valid implementations are object types. But in some cases, we have unions that for sure implement a union because they're a subunion. So let's give a particular example. Let's say you have a union of animal types that includes cows, wolves, all sorts of different animals. And then you have another union of animal types that are just, I don't know, domesticated animals. But they're also dutifully listed out by that parent union. There's no way for GraphQL to know that an object type with a field of that smaller union implements the parent union. And so in order to delineate on the union type, we have a couple, certainly many different syntax options, but basically the idea would be to simply allow putting a union inside one of the member types of a union when it's first specified. Again, I'm sorry that I can't share my screen for some reason this time, but I hope that explanation is basically straightforward. The goal would be to basically allow the GraphQL type system to be more robust and to allow type relationships to be better delineated by the existing types, and to allow GraphQL to better enforce type safety, or I should say type membership. We spoke about this last time, and we spoke about or a couple times ago, and we said that one of the downsides to this would be that if a union is allowed to specify a union or an interface, would be that a schema reader and even the execution engine would have to scour the schema and make sure that potentially leading to recursive problems. And so in this implementation, in the reference GraphQL PR, GraphQL PR, I got around that by requiring if a union contains a union or an interface as a member, that it must specify all of the, if it's an interface is listed as a member, it must specify all of the object types that implement that interface. And if a union is a member, the parent union must specify all of the child member types. And so actually, the only thing that has changed is that there's no automatic, I mean, we talked about this further working groups ago with the intersection types. we can run into problems with when things happen automatically. That can't happen because all the member types of the union are still specified manually. The only thing that's added is that the union or interface that we're trying to say is a member, that we'll later be trying to say is a member of that union, is also added in. The GraphQL JS PR also requires a change in introspection. To be able to build the schema from the introspection, we have to not only say what are the possible types, which refers to object types currently, and which pretty much shouldn't be a breaking change, right? So the GraphQL JS possible types will, the introspection value of possible types will stay the same and only include object types. But there'll be another value called member types. And that member types can possibly include interfaces and unions, as well as all the other members. And so you'll be able to build the schema from the introspection in the same exact way. And I think that's pretty much solves all the recursion, because no additional recursion has to happen, except a level of validation. We just have to make sure that that's true. But that's a similar sort of level of type checking that we currently do for interfaces that implement interface, and that level. So it doesn't seem like there's any additional complicated logic, certainly not in the PR that I was able to assemble. Nothing too complicated in what I've shared. So this solves a very narrow problem. So it, as generally the approach, there's a use case here, but it does involve additional complexity. And so I'm not saying that I necessarily think that it's worth it. I mean, that's for the, the working group to, as I said before, sort of for the working group to decide whether additional complexity is worth it. And it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve expressing, for example, that a union satisfies an interface. It solves that an interface satisfies a union. And so it doesn't solve everything. So that's with two caveats. But it actually, it was a little bit more complicated to solve that direction. I think this is much more straightforward, and maybe we'll open a window toward solving that one later. And and if this maybe advances to a next stage, but is felt like not really ready to be released until that problem is solved, that sort of approach, meaning the parallel problem is solved, maybe they should be like finalized together, but this could just advance a little bit further just because it seems simpler or first, or I don't know, but that's what I got so far.
Anyone have thoughts?
I like this solution a lot better than the last one that you proposed, Jakob. So good job. That's I think including the object types does solve that recursion issue well.
Yeah, in the linked example, there is an example with an interface of cloning info, and I don't list out in that example, just because it was the original iteration, every object that implements cloning info. But later in the comment down, I mentioned that I changed the proposal. I think it's, you should, for strictness. And so just if that's confusing anybody. For unions, I do list out them out, but I think we should list them out for both.
One question here. So it seems like the end goal that you would have in mind is the syntax that you described in the PR 950, where you can provide the implement syntax on a union level. Do we even need to implement unions of interfaces before that? Or just thinking there might be you could define it in different ways here. Now I could define the implement on the interface level, but also on the union level.
Yeah. I'm sorry, within PR 950 on the GraphQL spec, in that example there's a line that says allowed by 939, and that's the one where a union implements an interface. So that's the proposal that turned out to be a little bit more complex, and so that hasn't advanced yet. This proposal is for the for power cloning info, to say that cloning info interface would fulfill a union. And again, I apologize. I don't have all the types. They would have to be explicitly listed for cloning info in there. And then you would be able to later say that all these unions, cow or cloning info in that wolf type implements animal. But again, you would have to list out explicitly all the types of cloning info for the union. So that separate PR, that language of implements, of 939, it hit a problem with regards actually to introspection and the fields of such a union type. Maybe not insurmountable, but actually I thought to tackle it first, and they sort of are reverses of each other. So we might eventually, that's what I was saying before, we might want to, even if this PR is found reasonable, but it's thought maybe, listen, if we're going to do this, we want to make sure it's compatible with the reverse one of a union implementing an interface rather than an interface being rightfully considered a member of a union. We might want to release those in some spec version and like a cut version, meaning the final stage, I guess, together. This one seemed a little bit more straightforward, not necessarily more important. Not sure how important either of these. So again, it's to be determined whether the additional complexity is worth it. I think that it is, but obviously caution is a good idea. I think that it is, just because I think that if the type system can be made more robust, we should try to do that, because it unlocks just more power in the system. But I don't know that it's certainly not necessary. Certainly hasn't been until this point. I would mention that the original issue was posted by others, not by myself, and I picked it up just to find there's something interesting to work on. So I can't say that on a day-to-day basis, my life will be changed much.
We did in the long ago, and part of the decision that ended up having unions, they must express the list of objects rather than going through an intermediate. Like there's a reason why member types was omitted. I think we are considering it before. My major concern is going back to that original one, that there will be confusion between whether to use member types or possible types and how to interpret the differences between the two. And I'm still a bit worried about that. And I'll disagree with Benji. I liked your previous suggestion better. I liked that it was explicit rather than implicit, that rather than saying that there's some parent union that is a superset, which is I think what this allows you to do, really what you wanted to be able to say is this particular union is a subset of that union, or every member of this union implements an interface, applying sort of type set theory, that this is always this follows a constraint that exists elsewhere. And I liked the explicitness of that.
And this also solved a lot of issues that you have for clients, right? Where you say this union implements, guarantees you that this minimal thing is implemented. So with the other way around, what is the problem that we solve with that now? It's just essentially allowing that interfaces can be member types of unions now. Yeah.
Again, there's two different goals for robustness. I'm not sure what some people say like this better than previously. I'm not sure which iteration. I mean, there's been a few, again, to this non-urgent problem. So, but I do think I definitely see Lee's point, meaning where do we specify this, that a child union is a member, all the types of a child union or all the implementations of an interface are members of a union. Where do we specify that? I think we certainly, we could specify the parent union or the child. I think it makes, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I understand the advantages or disadvantages of both. I mean, maybe that's something to catalog, to compare the two methods. That could be the working point going forward.
What I liked was the previous proposal where a union implements an interface. So you're essentially saying that this union is guaranteed to have these fields. That actually solves real world problems that you have on the client side. With this, it kind of sounds like, okay, you can do that, but what's the use case for that?
Oh, yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I'm not sure. I mean, I have the use case set over here, set out in an example that says, now GraphQL will give you a validation error if ever you have a change. And so this is a, complex, basically the use case would be a complex type system when you want to make sure that you have a guarantee such that if you make any further changes, that relationship still holds. So it adds robustness overall rather than I think, because you could always say that it's not, I think you could leave it out, but it adds that level of robustness.
That robustness is also valuable though, right? Like as soon as you introduce that robustness constraint, then you can rely on it elsewhere. So if, I think the original motivation for interfaces, implementing interfaces, was this sort of actually like fulfilling an interface problem, right? You say like this interface describes something in a broad way. I wanted to find something in a more specific way. But rather than doing that only via a single concrete type, I actually want to, again, use an interface. And up until that particular proposal, it wasn't possible to do that. Interfaces, implementing interfaces is actually more about applying a constraint that says interface B definitely implements interface A. So if something says it needs an A, you can use a B, you'll be good. And I remember that being the original thrust of the last time you brought a variant of this through. And that's why I'm saying I liked the previous one better, was saying that, okay, again, I don't want to supply a specific concrete object type, but in this case, I want to supply a couple defined by a union. And I want to be able to tell you that this union is definitely going to be implementing that interface because I've specified that it must via this constraint. So that says, like, also in one part, the robustness part, the schema validation can now make sure that you stated that thing is true, and it can fail to we can make sure that there's a rule that says that the schema must abide by that. But also now it unlocks the ability to do that subtyping. So I'm curious if there's, I like that, because I think the flip side, sort of where you've gone with this to have both member types and parent types, is less about supplying that constraint on the subtype and more about saying, like, okay, you'd have to go back to this parent type and keep adding, like every time you had a subtype, you'd have to go back to this parent and add it to that list. And I'm concerned about the scalability of that.
Yeah, I guess I see. I mean, the reason the scalability problem, it's a tension, I guess, with the explicitness. Meaning in the other version, you would say, I guess, I mean, again, I was thinking also as a potential other approach. Let's say if we return to the line, I finally figured out how to share my screen. For some reason, it escaped me. If we have this line over here, unlocked by 939, where we said union cower wolf implements animal, we could form that more generally. And I think this is what you're saying, that any sort of union has to, let's put aside the word implements, but has to satisfy certain constraints. So we could say over here that one of the constraints is that it implements animal, and we could have some language over here, some nice, short, wonderful language that says that it has to also satisfy the union. And therefore, we'd be specifying that on the child level. So that was another approach. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That implements piece is nice because it's local to the subtype that you care about describing the constraint on, and that is where you've described the constraint, as opposed to saying that given a type called animal, there exists some union called cower wolf to keep an eye out for that, just so you know, implements animal. It's like instead you put it on the more specific piece.
Yeah.
And especially because you could combine that, right? It doesn't have to be just animal, but you could also have other interfaces as well there. So you could create this nice guarantee that combines several interfaces.
Okay, so I mean, basically, I'll take. You know what I'll do is actually other people have their hands raised. I'll take more feedback, I guess, but I can work on that as like an alternative. No rush with it.
Yeah.
And then I think Ivan had their hand.
I know we're over time, but I'll let people keep giving feedback, and then once we're clear, then we'll wrap the meeting.
Yeah, like short thing. Basically, like your previous proposal 939 provides some benefit to a client. I thought about what is criteria of benefits to a client, and like I call it directive test. Can we implement this feature as a directive, server specific directive? So you can think like you can create empty union now, and you can create like new directive called like implement interface, and it will be implementation detail of a server. So what we, and it provide like type guarantees and validation. You can implement it that way. But question here is client losing anything or not? Like in case of 939, client losing stuff, client losing ability to like query field directly, type generated types are worse on the client. So like 939 provide actual benefits, but this one is like just a constraint for SDL. So it's more like implementation detail in a sense. And previously, when we discussed interface implementing interfaces, we decided that having verbose schema is not an issue. So like I don't see why it's different, and provide a bit of trivia about interface implementing other interfaces. It's not just like chains. It was about, because like you can change output type in, if interface implement another interface and have a field returning another interface chain, you can update it. So example was pretty complex, but it basically allowed to express something new contract between client and server, and 939 fulfill with directive test. But this one is not, you can implement as a directive and it will be more or less the same functionality.
Yeah, I mean, that's great feedback. I mean, and specifically since we're talking about maybe changing it to where the child union or the you know what would be specified, maybe a directive over there would be a better way to express it. Yeah, thanks.
One last thought on this before we wrap is I remember looking at your pull request before about this and being worried about infinite recursion loops, which up until this point you had safely avoided by limiting this to only be interfaces. But if it is unions, just be aware that that might be something you have to account for. But I still think this is interesting. Like we marked it as RFC1 for a reason. I think like the being able to appropriately define these subtypes is still seems quite useful. Okay, folks, I know we are a bit over time, and sorry, Benji, to bump your last one. I know we've also lost a handful of attendees since we're running a little bit over. So feel free to async that or bring it to the next group meeting. And thank you all for joining. Healthy discussion all around. Have a good rest of your day. See you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.
Thank